Hello and welcome. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to the keynote for the ISWI 2021 on the sand crisis. My name is Benjamin. I'm going to be your host for this evening, and I'm going to soon be joined by Kiran Pereira, who's going to do her keynote. This is going to be about 40 to 50 minutes, and then we have ample time for questions. So there's going to be a Q&A at the end of this keynote. Please use, if you're on YouTube, feel free to use the YouTube chat. It should be, I think, on this way on your screen. If you're using Discord, please post your questions there and they will be all forwarded to us. And we'll do our best to answer these in this live session. Now, Kiran, who's joining us today, is the founder of sandstories.org. She is a social entrepreneur trying to promote and solve the global sand crisis. So providing solutions, not just saying what is wrong about it, but how can you make it better? She wrote a really great book, Sand Stories, Surprising Truth About the Global Sand Crisis and the Quest for Sustainable Solutions. She has been featured in multiple media. She is part of an award-winning documentary called The Sand Wars. She was featured in media outlets like the BBC, Economist, Financial Times, the ZDF, that's German broadcasting company, CNBC. And she is joining us this evening from our old hometown, London town. Hi, Kiran.
Hi there. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us today. So I did your intro. I think now it's up to you for your keynote, and then I'll be monitoring the questions and I'll save them all for later on.
Fantastic. Let me see if I can share my screen. Do you see this?
I got it now. Thank you.
Okay.
Stage is yours.
Fantastic. Right. So thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today as we talk about the global sand crisis and why we should care. I fell into this because I grew up in India in a place called Bangalore, and some of my earliest memories have to do with waking up at 2, 3 in the morning to go and fetch water from a public tap. It was always there was always a queue, people pushing and fighting and trying to get their pots filled before the taps run dry. So water was always a topic that was very dear to my heart. And as I grew up, I constantly read reports about the rivers being decimated because of sand mining. And at the same time, I saw trucks filled with sand flying up and down the road of Bangalore. This was at a time when Bangalore was transforming from a sleepy little town, a retirement town, to the Silicon Valley of India. And I asked myself this very simple question: if we are growing and if we're developing in a manner that destroys our environment, is it really sustainable? And it led me down a rabbit hole. You know, this is where I have landed today, and I'm very happy to share what I've learned so far. Why are we talking about sand? So the UNEP says that the scale of the challenge, the scale of the activity is so huge that it makes it one of the biggest sustainability challenges of the 21st century. You can see here a tiny little image, and this particular image is from the book, where I show all the different uses of sand that I have discovered so far. It's used, of course, you know that it's used in concrete, and you know that it's used in glass. You may not be familiar with the extent to which it is used. For example, in concrete, concrete consists of 60 to 75% sand and gravel by volume. Glass consists about flat glass consists about 70% silica sand. Sand is also used in an industrial process called sand casting, which is used to mold metal objects, many of the metal objects that you see around us. And for every ton of molten metal poured, you require about 3 to 6 tons of sand, specific types of sand. So because of these kind of uses, and they're used in a huge variety of different contexts, right from the energy sector, whether we're talking about dams or fracking, or even solar panels require quartz or silica sand. So you see that sand is a commodity that is in much demand, and the challenge comes from the fact that there are many different types of sand, and they're not all interchangeable. So you can't, for example, desert sand is not often used in construction because it's shaped by wind rather than water, and so the grains are too rounded to offer concrete strength. There are companies that are working on finding alternatives to make desert sand more suitable. At the same time, it's not something that's mainstream just as yet. So when we talk about glass, for example, it requires a very specific type of sand that is free from impurities like iron, so that the glass does not get colored, things like that, right? So you require very specific types of sand for very specific uses, and because these are ultimately come from specific places, these places are limited. Sand and gravel are not renewable resources in human timescales. They are renewed, but along geological timescale. Whereas when we use it in a manner that absolutely does not consider this particular temporal scale. And so it can create a huge mismatch between the rate at which nature forms sand and the rate at which humans use it. So as far as humans are concerned, as far as policymakers are concerned, sand and gravel should be treated as a finite resource, and therefore they need to be managed very, very carefully. Why does it matter, and why are we talking about this now? We're talking about this now because the 20th century saw a 23-fold increase in raw materials, in materials extracted for construction of buildings and transport infrastructure. And as the UNEP report explains, if you think about this particular resource in terms of a bank account, if it's a finite resource, and you start increasing your expenditure by 23%, by 23-fold, it's not going to last very long, right? So the way to look at it is that the social, economic, environmental, geopolitical costs of mining this sand are increasing quite rapidly. And that's what we need to be aware. You'll often see reports in the media that says, oh, we are running out of sand. But what you need to understand is in geological terms, there's plenty of sand. But sometimes the sand may be in the wrong place, like it may be below a nature reserve. It could be that this sand has been designated as a fishing ground. It could be that it is set aside for wind farms. So because of all these competing uses and growing urbanization and growing populations as well as changing lifestyle, the amount of sand that we have available to us is limited and needs to be managed. So as I said, there are tremendous impacts from mining sand. Here you see on this slide, you see impacts from mining construction aggregate. So here are a few countries from Asia. You see Vietnam, and absolutely tremendous impacts you find because of indiscriminate sand mining. You find people losing homes that they had saved up for years. You find countries losing infrastructure because of erosion and the riverbank instability. You find that people are also affected, miners are also affected as they mine this particular sand. And it also impacts on traditional livelihoods. So fisheries, for example, are impacted. We're also seeing a growing level of violence against people who stand up to sand mining. So whether that is activists or journalists or people who are government officers or even just farmers who are protesting against sand mining on their land. and we're seeing increasing in some places. There's a sand mafia. It's not in all places, but in some places it's particularly acute. Places like India, there are also instances in China, in Ghana, Vietnam, Cambodia. It's a growing list. Now I want to talk to you about, you saw previously construction sand, right? And its impacts. And that's what you will see mostly in the discourse. But I also want to alert you that there are impacts even for mineral sand mining, which is often considered a very well-regulated industry. There could be impacts. Here's a case study from Madagascar, which I again talk about in the book, where this particular mine is by a British-Australian mining company, very, very famous. I think Rio Tinto, one of the biggest in the world. The picture, the second picture you see of the lakes, is where the company exceeded its mining permit, and it kind of illegally encroached on the buffer zone, what was meant to be a buffer zone to protect communities. And this was admitted after a protracted kind of investigation by a British charity. They had to commission expert studies in order to prove that there was actually, that the boundaries had been crossed, and there was actually the water was being enriched with radionucleotides. Now, Rio Tinto says that the radionucleotides that are occurring in the water are naturally occurring, but they haven't been able to evidence this assertion. Andrew Lee Stuss, the charity that has been working on behalf of the people of Madagascar, says that mining operations are leading to waters that people use for fishing, for various other activities, being enriched with radionucleotides that could damage their health. You could see this particular mine was also contentious for a variety of reasons. You can see a lady here weaving a mat, right? That reed is called mahampi, and it's a very, very important plant for this indigenous community. It's part of their language, and it provided a very important livelihood for the women, especially in times when crops did not grow, food was scarce. They made products with this particular reed, and they sold it. But what happened is when the mining operation started, not only did the company displace people, right, for the mining operations, but they also they offered offset, right? So in order to offset their operations in this place, they kind of said, okay, we will not mine in this particular place. Now, the people who are dependent on the forests in that particular place were completely locked out of food. They could not grow food in fertile lands, so they were pushed off into non-fertile lands. They could not gather firewood. They could not gather medicines that they traditionally. So they really were impacted in quite a strong way. I'll move on now. So you can see this particular image here. I'd like to highlight that women in particular are affected by this sand and gravel mining. You can see pictures here from the first picture you see here is of a farming community in North India, where the women stood in, they did what is called a Jal Satyagraha. Basically, Satyagraha is a non-violent protest form that was popularized by Mahatma Gandhi. And this particular standing in the water for several hours in protest of of illegal sand mining happening on their farms without their consent was something that they were protesting against. So when sand mining happens like this, what happens is that or when projects are planned. For example, in the second picture you see here, these women, their livelihood was to collect clam shells and sell them in the market. And they were planning for a port at this particular place. So when you plan infrastructure, but you don't take into account previous uses of how the space is being used by women, that's a problem, because their labor can be rendered invisible. In the third picture, you see these women had to travel 30 kilometers outside their village to find employment. This is where they harvest these reeds that are again used to weave mats in South India. So the fourth picture you see is of this lady, again, who lost access to water supply and had to travel several kilometers in order to fetch water. Or this last picture on the top, you see a family from Bangladesh losing traditional ancestral land because of illegal dredging in the river. So as you see, there are many, many impacts, whether it's mining affected communities, or it could also be women who are mining, women who are miners themselves. Quite often their labor as miners becomes invisible because they're at the lower end of the spectrum. And you see a mine from Rajasthan here, where this lady was forced to work in this quarry mine because her husband died of silicosis. And she has, since he was a sole earning member, she has no recourse but to go back to work in this, even though she knows that they will probably meet the same fate. Another picture in Nepal, where you see the woman carrying a really heavy load. It can lead to health complications carrying such heavy loads every single day. So it can also impact journalists and activists. You see the last two pictures that you see at the bottom are pictures of a journalist called Sandhya Ravishankar and an activist called Sumaira Abdullari. Both are leading voices in the fight against illegal sand mining in India. Sandhya Ravishankar was fighting against mineral sand mining, illegal mineral sand mining happening in Tamil Nadu, in the southern state of India. Sumaira Abdullari is an activist that fights against illegal sand mining happening in Mumbai, in the western part of the country. There has been an attempt on Sumaira Abdullari's life, and she narrowly escaped being killed when a truck almost toppled her car over a bridge into the river below. And she kind of narrowly escaped it because she had learned to drive. Her husband happens to be a rally driver. She had learned to drive. She had picked up some serious driving skills. So Sandhya Ravishankar, for example, also faced one day when she was meeting with a source in a coffee shop. That meeting was documented and it was published on a private blog. So video footage of that meeting was collected by police officers, people dressed as police officers, we don't know. But how it landed in, how it made its way to a private blog is anybody's guess. Basically, there's a lot of corruption involved. And the message is clear that we are watching you, every step you take, we're watching you, and you better be careful. So it did affect her ability to get information. Her sources were wary of talking to her, things like that. We don't often think about sand, right? And sand can be such a crucial strategic resource, but it can be. And here are some of the impacts that I wanted to talk to you about. So, is it just happening in developing countries? I'd argue that it's not. It's a global problem, and it needs to be treated as such. You'll find the vast majority happening in developing countries, simply because of the scale of development. However, you will also find cases in other parts of the world. They manifest slightly differently, though, and you need to look carefully. So how, for example, this particular, I'd urge you to read this particular series of articles from ID News. It's in French. It's a very well-written series of articles. It talks about this fight, the battle over gravel pits in this particular canton in Switzerland. In the other picture that you see is the picture of a Belgian offshore area. Now here, scientists have done some phenomenal work. They have actually mapped out the entire offshore area to discover where there are particularly rich deposits of sand and how long it might last. And what they found was that the coarse fraction of sand, the kind of sand that is important for the construction industry, will last only about 80 years. So because of this, Belgium is now one of the strongest contenders on the circular economy. You find some fantastic action happening in encouraging industry to kind of develop in a manner where materials are used in a cyclical manner. So finding out how much sand we have and how long can be very, very important, because as they found out, the sand that they did have was limited simply because of wind farms or fishing areas and things like that. So it can be managed. So we've talked about mineral sand mining. We've talked about construction, mining sand and gravel for the construction industry. Now I want to talk. I want to show you a tiny little snippet of a video of frac sand mining in the US. Okay, so the energy sector is also a significant user of sand and gravel. So this video has no audio. Just take a look at it, and then I'll talk a bit more. So you see, it's quite. You can see from the kind of some of the hills that are being destroyed or blown apart in order to get this silica sand, very, very rounded silica sand, are 500 million years old. So you're talking about really a fossil resource, one fossil resource, which is being used in search of another fossil resource, right? And it's kind of it's kind of crazy that this particular use is even permitted, but it is because you need to look at the regulatory setup. And in the US, the frac sand mining infrastructure is exempted from a lot of laws, like a lot of laws that I have mentioned in the book. Take a look. And so it's kind of the volumes. A normal fracking well can use anywhere between 50 to 70 rail cars of sand. With advance in technology, they have found that they can increase the yield of wells if they use more sand. And so, or they're trying to front load the yields to the first year instead of having it taper down in over the course of several years. So they're trying to front load profits. And so you find that companies are now using 100 to 250 rail cars of sand. So all those rail cars of sand, just imagine the volume of sand that is being filled in to frack just one well, right? It's insane. This is a non-renewable resource, and it just doesn't make sense to me, at least. So yeah, I want to, so I've talked a lot about the problems so far, but as Benjamin said, my focus is also on providing some potential solutions. There is no one-size-fits-all solution, unfortunately, because of the variety of different contexts, variety of different uses, the law of the land, and a variety of different capabilities. There are many different solutions, and depending on the geography, people will have to decide which is best for them. But just to give you some ideas of things that are being tried out. Here's an example of rammed earth construction in Ghana. Now, the specialty about rammed earth is that they try to reduce the amount of cement being used, very tiny amount of cement being used, in order to hold together clay, right? The soil that is being rammed together. And it kind of reduces the carbon footprint of the material, especially if the soil is excavated on site and it's used on site. It can tremendously reduce the carbon footprint. And as you can see, it's absolutely possible to build well, beautiful structures. It's possible to live well. Here's another example of a company called Made in Earth, operating in South India. They're building apartment complexes with Adobe. So you see, again, these are the concept design pictures, and absolutely beautiful buildings. You find that that's a community college that is being designed with, again, natural local materials. This is an example that I came across a few days ago. This is this young lady is called Shruti Pandey. She's the founder and CEO of this company called Structure Eco. They make building materials out of agricultural waste. So basically, they make bio-based panels that are fireproof, that are termite-proof, that have great acoustic insulation. And she has won several awards because they set up COVID care facilities. Basically, she built hospitals for COVID patients in a matter of a few weeks, and in remote places, right? So it's absolutely possible. I'm particularly inspired by young people, and their willingness to look at things differently and find solutions. Here's an example of a school building made with mud and bamboo in Bangladesh. This particular building was designed by a German architect based on the kind of houses that were built in the region. And it was built by the villagers themselves. So you can see it's absolutely beautiful. There's no cement used at all in this particular building. And this particular building has seen over 20 monsoons. So you can see that it does last with, it can, so it's great for the climate. It provides a really, it maintains the right temperature. It's great for health because there are no volatile organic compounds, things like that. So it's really beautiful. It's possible to build with mud and build well, depending on if you use the materials locally available. Here's an example from the UK, where this is a community in Leeds, where they have managed to use straw bale insulation to kind of reduce their annual gas consumption by nearly 90% compared to the average for Leeds. So it's really fantastic. It's a brilliant community. They grow their own food. They're as low impact as possible. Of course, I spoke about this on the ZDF show on the German Ministry of Environment has in Berlin has chosen a timber construction for their particular office. And so timber construction is growing in popularity in many parts of the world. It's important to know that one size does not fit all, and it's important to look at sustainably sourced timber, because that's really, really important. Otherwise, we could be back in the same problem. The reason why timber offers some sort of a solution vis-a-vis sand and gravel and as aggregate in concrete is because timber is a renewable resource, where in human timescales, where sand and gravel is not in human timescales. So there are companies called looking at using raw earth construction, just using building absolutely beautiful buildings with the idea behind this particular project is if earth is not bound by cement and concrete and things like that, then when design changes or you decide to build something new or add an extra room or things like that, it becomes very easy to remold the material and keep the material in use for much, much longer. So here you see pictures of waste-based bricks. This is by a company called Stone Cycling. Now, the image that you see on the left-hand side is a picture of a building in the 11th Avenue, New York. All the tiles on the facade are from tiles which were tiles which were made using construction and demolition waste. So you can see it's absolutely beautiful. You would never guess if you just look at these buildings, as they are. On the right, you see a picture of Starbucks. That is a Starbucks drive-through in Europe. Again, all the tiles that you see here made from waste-based bricks. Now, in 2016, there was a World Economic Forum report that spoke about how the construction industry is the biggest consumer of raw materials on Earth, how the construction industry contributes anywhere from 25 to 40% of global carbon emissions. And it's based on a linear model. Much of the resources that are used in the construction industry are mined. We make, and then at the end of life, we simply discard it, just chuck it in the landfill. And that's a huge waste of resources. So demolition should be a last resort, but in the event we do have to demolish a building, we must reuse the material there because of the kind of cost that it comes with, because of the social environmental impacts that material comes with, and it's not reflected in the cost of the sand and gravel at all in the first place, right? Of course, if you're able to scale up this ambition, take it to a city level, then the kind of change that you can see is simply fantastic. Here you see the city of Amsterdam, for example, has chosen to become 100% circular by 2050. They've placed this ambition on public record. They want to halve the use of raw materials used in their city by 2030. That's less than 10 years away, right? And that's the kind of ambition we need. It's because it's absolutely possible to reimagine the way we build our cities, to try new things. And you see some of the best work on the circular economy happening in Amsterdam, in Belgium, in several other places. It's a growing movement. Also, places like Zurich are also great examples. They're doing, in 2002, for example, the city of Zurich tried an experimental building. They commissioned a public building, a school, out of recycled concrete. I think it was about 80% recycled concrete. Then in 2005, they made it mandatory for all public buildings to be built using recycled concrete. In 2015, they added another layer to it. They said all public buildings must be built using not only recycled concrete, but also low carbon cement. So that's great, right? And so today you find buildings that are being built with 95%, 98% recycled concrete in Zurich. So that's the kind of ambition that we need to see across the world. Of course, they were able to do it because from an energy perspective, you have to have recycled concrete for all buildings kind of makes sense only when it's available within a 25-kilometer radius. But their example also shows us that supply often follows demand. If there's a demand for it, then you will find more and more people building capacity. So I'd like to suggest a few more resources that you can tap into. Feel free to make a note of this, and yeah, these are great resources. There are several more. If you go to my website, you will find some more papers. And that's my contact details. So I'm going to stop sharing now, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kiran, for this amazing presentation. Like really eye-opening, for me, as the importance of sand, the impact of sand mining of all the different kinds, and that is basically everywhere, right? That's some things you might, we heard a lot of people on the chat said, oh yeah, gravel, concrete, I knew that, but where else is it? So I found this really interesting, and also the link to other major, economical pollutants, right? Like where it's like, oh, fracking, which a lot of people are talking about in not very positive terms, and it's also consuming a lot of sand, making it even, but people not necessarily talk about sand. And I think this was a big question that came out on the chat. You mentioned timelines, right? Okay, 80 years for construction, and we had a few people wondering, okay, how is it with other industries? So we have a shortage coming up. There's a lot of controversy about the ecological and social impact, and also from my own background, I know that you need a lot of sand, especially glass and other like rare earth materials for a lot of high-tech manufacturing that, for example, we're building on to solve our dependency on unsustainable energy sources. And so this is a lot of really, concerning things. But for example, I think Tom mentioned it before, and Fatima, for example, I did not hear about this topic before I researched for your keynote here. What is your view on this one? How is this topic not more present? The global climate crisis comes up. Why is this not as widely known as other ecological topics? What's your view on that one?
I wish I knew. I fell into this rabbit hole 10 years ago, and my reaction is like, why isn't anyone talking about this? This is absolutely everywhere. And the more I learned about it, the more alarmed I became. It's just that the more I learned, I did not want to write a book that was a doom and gloom, because it's so depressing. We already have too many crises already. So, I was trying to look for people who are already working on solutions, and I found that there are solutions. But you're absolutely right. This isn't, it seems to fall in our blind spot. The only time we talk about sand is when we are going on a beach holiday, or we want to, we don't seem to remember sand otherwise, but we must, because it's such an important part of our everyday life, whether it's the technology we use, or the buildings we sit in, or the glass we look out from, or it's absolutely everywhere.
I mean, I have to admit, so for example, the last time I thought about sand more thoroughly was when my nephew got a new, like a little sand pit. But we actually looked at recycled and washed sand. I didn't pay much attention to it, but I did ask my brother about it. So it was recycled. And I think that leads me to a really great question we had from Tom. Tom, thank you very much for asking it on the YouTube chat. So how can we preserve sand as a resource? It's a finite resource, right? And you mentioned, okay, we can recycle or so on, but what's for an everyday responsible consumer, what are things to reduce our sand footprint, if we reuse that term that's quite often used with carbon fuels?
I think we're at a stage where we just are beginning to find out the impact of our own sand use, our own sand footprint, so to speak. One of the biggest challenges of this particular topic is that we do not have scientific data, right? So far, but it's such an important topic, and going forward, you will find a lot more data coming out. But so for the general user, it's very hard to know what to do. But I think the biggest stumbling block is that people just don't know. People just are unaware that this is a problem. So raising that awareness, the biggest thing that you can do is trying to that we can do is trying to educate ourselves about the various dimensions of this particular sand crisis, and looking at it in our own lives, like the things we use, the companies we buy products from, where are they getting the sand from? Is there sand in their supply chain? Asking these questions, I think, is a huge step forward. Because at the moment, the only people who benefit from the status quo are people who, where this particular topic doesn't seem to feature on their radar just yet.
Thank you very much for explaining that. Mayarundi just commented that it's a huge problem in Sri Lanka and that she's very thankful for bringing up that topic. I think there were a few questions around how to get more info, but I think let's leave that for the end, that people have the newest links and everything on. And building on your current answer, you linked to what Nicholas asked us in the chat on Discord. Thank you, Nicholas, for the question, which is about, okay, how can I actually spot these ecologically or sustainable, socially sustainable sources of sand? Like you mentioned, how can I find this out? Is there like a label? Is there an agency, an association I can check with? Okay, is the manufacturer, that service provider, are they using a sustainable source of sand, or is it more on the the opposite side, really exploitative of resources?
So there is work to kind of build this knowledge. The United Nations is putting in place, so the Grid Geneva is putting in place a global sand observatory that will keep track and monitor. Things are still not yet defined, but I imagine that we will have an international body that kind of oversees this. But at the local scale, I don't think something like this exists. So even if you have the passion to find out more and create it at the local scale, I think that's a fantastic thing. And let me know, and I will be sure to share it with everybody.
We definitely have one action for all the people who ask how to get active and how to do something actively is research. Is research locally what's available. Maybe fund your own. That's, I think, definitely one key takeaway point. One thing we had also come up on the chat was on so looking at where sand is used and looking at, okay, how can we get a sustainable source of it? And you mentioned some great projects where, for example, recycled bricks, waste bricks are used, or for example, timber is used. I'm really thankful you mentioned, with sustainability of timber and how that is important, and how there's no like one catch fits all solution to this. But what are maybe some guiding principles you could give to people to navigating alternatives to sand, right? For example, I mean, one of the things I thought, okay, more plastic, less glass for drinking bottles or other things. What would be your advice on guiding principles when making these kind of decisions and looking at, okay, what could I use instead of this sand consuming product?
For timber, for example, there are certifications like FSC certified wood and stuff. Mm-hmm. Although there have been reports about even these certifications having some problems because they propagate a monoculture of a particular species of fast-growing timber woods, right? So, and not all communities are consulted, or not all communities want such species of wood growing near them. So anytime we try to impose one particular solution across the board, that becomes a problem. So I think the best solution would be to look locally. Like before concrete became the dominant way of building, people still built buildings, right? There was a thriving culture. There was every place had its own distinct style of architecture. It had a soul. We seem to have lost that in today's world. So it's about reconnecting with that sense of place, with that sense of culture and community. It's about finding the kind of resources that are available, the skill sets that are available locally, that would be your best bet. And there's plenty of groups that are popping up, particularly in Europe. There are really a lot. Actually, even in Africa, even in India, there are many groups. Young people are doing a fantastic job of choosing alternate construction materials. So just look around you, and I'm sure you'll find examples.
Very cool. So I think that's very helpful on the architecture side of things. How would you see it, right, with the debate? I think that came up in one of your previous discussions that I watched online. What's about glass versus plastic? That always seems to be this big topic of, wait, what? Everyone tells me I should have more glass, glass bottles and everything. How do you see that discussion then?
Glass is an infinitely recyclable material, at least in theory, right? So the difference is that there's a difference between theory and practice. In theory, this glass can be recycled infinitely. In practice, that's not what happens. You find that counties in the US are giving up glass recycling schemes because they're not profitable enough. So what seems to be the problem? I was intrigued. At the same time, you find countries like Belgium, like some of the Nordic countries, doing a phenomenal job. They recycle over 90% of their glass. And so why is there such a discrepancy? The basic discrepancy lies in segregation at source. So what I mean by that, so you see this particular glass, right? This color comes from a particular additive, a chemical that's added in order to get this color. And there are some fits. So maybe this particular glass may not be recyclable. But generally, colored glass that you find, wine bottles or things like that, is the color comes because of an additive. Now, when you mix all this glass together, those chemicals can become contaminants in the glass stream. And then it's not profitable for people to kind of recycle that. So that's a huge, just consumer behavior, wherever consumers manage to segregate glass at source, where they are clean, then they are, all the brown bottles go in together, all the green bottles go in together, you find fantastic recycling rates, right? That's a major challenge, just consumer behavior. Also, sometimes glass is for example, the glass facades that we use in our buildings, they haven't been built for disassembly. So they have been built in a time and in a ethos which believe that we have plenty of resources. It's absolutely no problem. We have to worry about energy, protecting energy, and there's no problem with sand. As you can see, this sand is being extracted from places that are really precious. So this kind of message hasn't yet gone through, right? So we have to designing materials for disassembly is a step that's going, when we remove materials, when we remove this glass window, like storing it carefully without any contamination. For example, for glass to be recycled, glass cullet, even minor contact with stainless steel will mean that the glass can suddenly break because of critical inclusions. So it needs to be protected from any sort of contamination for it to be profitable for the glass manufacturers. What I find a little hard to wrap my head around is that in nature, this sand is formed over hundreds and thousands and millions of years, and is formed by a variety of different purposes, right? In variety of different processes. In some places, it's through the weathering of volcanic rocks. In other places, it's just metamorphic rocks, and like in other places, it's organisms, living organisms that are contributing to the formation of the sand. In either way, I mean, in all these processes, it takes a tremendous amount of time. But in the industries that we have built in order to consume the sand, the glass, for example, I was shocked to find that a glass factory does not shut down for 15, 20 years. And, we produce, I can't remember, I think it was 800 tons a week, or 800, just an insane amount of tonnage per week. The kind of volumes we go through per week, where this activity cannot stop. Compared, when you juxtapose it with the rate at which sand is formed, is kind of crazy. Same goes for dredging. Dredging companies, for example, operate 24 hours, 7 days a week, unless there is something wrong with the machine. Mm-hmm. So these kind of rates of extraction are absolutely not congruent with the kind of resource it is. And that's something we need to keep in mind. I think I went on a tangent. I'm not sure I answered your question.
No, you did. I really like in what you mentioned on one of the things we do in Germany, for example, is you have segregated areas where you put your bottles in. And I'll definitely make my best to separating it works, but I have to admit, I'm not always cleaning it super properly. So I think an important thing, if it's available to segregate glass, right, for recycling, clean it properly, hand it in properly, I think is an action we can all take. I really liked also your comment on, architectural glass. We have people here who might study and maybe want to become architects. So if you're one of these people, think about, what you said about design for disassembly and reuse. Don't just build the building and then we'll tear it down in 50 years, but how can we reclaim, reuse these resources? And I really like what you said there about glass, and you went into some really great detail here to understand the topic. We have another Nicholas, there seem to be a lot of them around, and Discord at the moment has a follow-up question to another resource often used in construction, which is concrete. So why is recycled concrete not used more often? Is it similar to, so glass, I know, for example, it's a lot high energy investment to get it cleared out and recycled. Is it mostly cost reasons? Are there also any other, downsides that are just internal to using reduced concrete?
So when I was researching for my book, I went to a site that was recycling this construction. It was extracting aggregate basically from construction and demolition waste. And it was really surprising to see that this very mixed kind of material comes in, all sorts of debris, construction debris, and then at the end of it, there was this huge octopus, a metal octopus with different arms branching out in different directions, kind of a thing. And at the end of each arm was a neatly segregated pile of aggregate graded in various size fractions. And it was so interesting to hear delegates, from that particular conference speak. They were arguing that we don't call regular sand and gravel as quarried sand and gravel. Yet, when it's recycled sand and gravel, they are meant to call it recycled sand and gravel, and they felt that it was some sort of stigma because people didn't want to claim that they were using recycled sand and gravel. Although they were buying it in boatloads and they were using it in their buildings, they did not want to be identified as buyers of recycled sand and gravel. So there may be an element of perception of we're not quite sure if this is okay kind of a thing. So I think building confidence in the consumer in the quality of these recycled materials through certifications and also through just talking about prioritizing it. It can also be that there are in some cases they also mention that consumer expectation, for example, in the UK there is a very strong charity sector, right? You go to a charity shop and you buy secondhand clothes and things like that. And you don't expect those clothes to be more expensive than new clothes. And so the same kind of expectation is passed on to building materials, right? We expect recycled sand and gravel to be cheaper than new sand and gravel. But what people don't realize is this new sand and gravel, when nature has done all the work for us and neatly segregated materials and sized it and shaped it for us, and we're just gathering it and using it, the cost has been externalized onto society and onto the environment. And that's not reflected in the true cost. When it comes to recycled material, there's cost involved, right? In setting up facilities, in training people, in marketing, in so many other things. So there's definitely cost involved. So it's not an even playing field. And cost could be one of the reasons where we're not seeing as much traction as we should. Also, just the demand, like people are not aware that it's possible. India, for example, has now changed its building codes to allow up to 20% recycled aggregate, recycled concrete in reinforced concrete applications. But it's one of the biggest consumers, and they're at 20%. We're in the right direction, but Zurich is doing 95, 98%, so that's the kind of scale that we need to reach quickly.
That disappeared for a quick second. I had some video issues, but really like what you said about the externalization of cost, right? Where it's like similar to a lot of other industries, like for example, recycled materials, like rare earth materials that we use in batteries, in computers, and a lot of high-tech electronics. Like, oh, it's just cheaper. I just dig it out of the earth. Yeah, well, because you're not taking into consideration all the pollution, destroying the ecosystem, taking someone's livelihood away. That's not factored in your little cost model for a little, AAA battery. So I think you're really highlighting a great importance here for becoming active and for also keeping companies accountable for these external costs, right? So we have that with CO2 certificates, and I hope you mentioned it. It's becoming more and more important also in international organizations. Hopefully we'll see something similar for sand and taking that into consideration. So it's really, really great that you elaborate on that. I have a few more questions prepared, but I just want to have a quick look and looking at all people on YouTube and Discord. What are your questions for Kiran? So now we had, I think, Martin, you asked a question. Actually, I think this is a good one to maybe just quickly come back to. So you mentioned 80 years, right? Is the estimate for sand on in construction. So Martin asked a follow-up question about how is it for other areas? Is there like a rough timeline? Do we have something like, with oil, fossil fuels, there's this fancy tagline, oh, the oil will run out at that time, and we need to deal with that. Is there something similar to sand?
Everybody's searching for peak sand. Have you reached peak sand yet? But scientists are very wary of answering that because we simply don't have the data. We just don't know. Belgian scientists have been extraordinarily, they're well ahead of many other places in trying to analyze and find how much sand we have available, make a model of the offshore area. But it's also a very resource-intensive process, right? It's not, and it's a tiny country. If you think about a country like India trying to replicate what Belgium has done, it would take a huge amount of resources to kind of look at the entire coastline and map that out. So we kind of know what's possible, but it hasn't been done yet. I suspect, though, in the coming years, you will find more and more such studies. And remember, sand and gravel are mined from a variety of different sources. They are mined from inland quarries, they are mined from riverbeds, riverbanks, they're mined from lakes, they're mined from the seabed. And it depends on the geography, it depends also on the law of the land. So there's no one size fits all for each location. It really varies. It depends on the country.
I have to say, so one thing that I am aware of as a sand resource, sandstone. So as an avid climber in the south of England, there's a lot of sandstone around there, and they're very protective about it. So you can only climb with certain equipment because it is a fascinating natural beauty and ecosystem that you definitely want to preserve. And talking about that, being active, so we had a lot of people asking about this. So thank you, Fatima, Tom, and Jordan, namely, who really asked, okay, what can they do, right? ISWI is all about a lot of young people, a lot of active people who want to be active for a cause and want to know what can they do about it. And so you mentioned some things. You gave us some amazing sources to read up on, and you had the great recommendation to research in your own area. Because it's still a young topic, you might start something on your own. But what are things you would like to really tell people here on ISWI? These are the things you can actively do and that you can research. What are questions to ask? Who should I ask? Is there a local politician I should talk to? Are there any organizations to join that you would definitely recommend that are maybe acting on a larger scale?
So maybe I can. So there's this. Do you see this thing that I've put in the chat?
Yeah, we'll share it on the, maybe our hosts can share it on YouTube comments and on Discord, please, that everyone has access to it. So they should have it in a second.
So they, for example, are very active in holding to account cement companies, basically, because it has an extended impact, right, on many different. You'll find several interesting case studies. And that might be one option for students in Germany and various other places. So I would suggest that depending on look for NGOs, look for non-profit organizations that are already working in this space, and there are many, right? In whether it's India or Africa or countries in Africa, or there are so many non-profit organizations that are already active in this space, and so kind of trying not to reinvent the wheel, but kind of partnering with someone is important so we can move forward. And this particular topic is so new, and yet nobody talks about it. It's an environmental crisis that is really, really little known. So sharing whatever you learn, I think is important. I have a newsletter that goes out at the end of every month, where I share information on solutions and problems that are cropping up in various parts of the world. So that could give you some more ideas as well, and workshops that are coming up, and events that are coming up, things like that.
So, and I guess then another good starting point would be then your website from your organization that you founded, sandstories.org. Yeah. So maybe we just share that for convenience as well on the chat. Our hosts, if you would please do that. And Kiran, I think at this point, thank you so much for taking the time to join us for our large, international audience we have here, sharing about, this key information about what this topic is about, why it is important, why it affects all of us. And, I really like the discussion about, the pros and cons of different sources, where we can get it, what you can do about it. And all I can say, thank you so much for joining. I think you might get a few people signing up and asking you questions via sandstories.org. And I have also 2 quick organizational changes before we close the keynote for today. One is a quick reminder for all participants. Tomorrow are workshops. Please sign up. Have a look on Discord. There you can find the links. And we have an open space sessions coming up tomorrow. You can find all the information on the ISWI 2021 website, where there's also the full program of the event. I personally will definitely try to be on a few more. And maybe Kiran, I'll see you around on those. Thank you so much again for joining us today. And have a great evening, everybody. And talk to you all soon.
Thank you all. Thank you so much for this opportunity. It's fantastic.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.